In the grand parlor of Silver Ridge Ranch, Clara Whitaker stood frozen as a room full of lawyers, landowners, and businessmen turned to stare at her in absolute shock. The will had just been read. Her husband, the quiet foreman everyone had mocked, had just inherited the largest fortune in Montana Territory. But that wasn't what made the room gasp. It was what Clara said next that would change everything. Every worker on this ranch will have their wages doubled by morning. The silence that followed was deafening. This is the story of how the woman an entire town dismissed as worthless became the most powerful voice in the valley, and it started with 2 water buckets and a stranger on a dusty trail. If you're watching this, stay until the very end to see how this incredible journey unfolds. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far Clara's story travels across the world. The dawn air cut like broken glass across Clara Whitaker's face as she stepped out of the cabin into another merciless Montana morning. The sky was still bruised purple at the edges, the sun not yet cruel enough to bake the moisture from her skin, but she knew what was coming. She had lived through 28 summers in Red Hollow Valley, and every single one had taught her the same bitter lesson. Some lives were meant to stay small. Her father had told her that once, his voice flat with the kind of certainty that came from watching dreams die slow deaths in hard country. Her mother had never said the words aloud, but Clara felt them in every disappointed glance, every sharp instruction, every comparison to her younger sister Marianne, who had golden hair and a delicate laugh and had married a shopkeeper's son at 19. Clara's hands were already rough by then, too rough for the kind of man who might offer her a way out. She moved toward the creek with 2 wooden buckets hanging from a yoke across her shoulders, her spine already beginning its familiar ache. The path was worn smooth by her own feet. Thousands of trips, thousands of mornings exactly like this one. Behind her, smoke rose from neighboring cabins where other families were waking, and Clara knew without looking that curtains would twitch as she passed. They always did. The whispers had started years ago, sometime after Marianne's wedding, when it became clear that Clara would not follow the same path. At first the words were almost kind, sympathetic murmurs about how difficult it must be for a girl with such plain features, such unremarkable prospects. But sympathy had a short lifespan in a town where everyone struggled, and soon the whispers turned sharp. Old maid. Burden to her family. No man would take a woman like that. Clara had learned to hold her head at an angle that suggested she couldn't hear them, even when every word landed like a stone against her ribs. She had learned to make herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable, as if she could somehow apologize for the simple fact of her existence by taking up less space in the world. The creek ran cold and clear over smooth stones, a small mercy in a landscape that offered few. Clara knelt at the edge, her skirt soaking up water and mud, and began filling the buckets. The sound of rushing water almost covered the voices behind her. Almost. "Still hauling water like a pack mule," someone said. Mary Preston, the blacksmith's wife, speaking to her daughter just loud enough to be heard. 28 years old and not a prospect in sight. Her poor mother. Clara's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes on the buckets. One full, then the other. Simple tasks, one after another. That was how you survived. She lifted the yoke back onto her shoulders, feeling the immediate bite of weight against bone, and started the long walk home. Her path took her past the livery stable, the general store, the small church where Reverend Morrison preached about grace and redemption to people who seemed to have very little of either. Thomas Garrett stood outside his family's feed store, arms crossed, watching her approach. He was 32, unmarried, and known for drinking too much on Saturday nights and saying cruel things he claimed not to remember come Sunday morning. "Morning, Clara," he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone men used when they wanted everyone nearby to hear. "Still looking for a husband? I might know a blind man over in Copper Falls who'd take you." Laughter erupted from the men gathered near the store's entrance. Clara kept walking, her face burning, the bucket sloshing water down her already soaked skirt. "Now, Tom, that's unkind," one of the other men said, but he was grinning. "A blind man might have standards, too." More laughter. Clara's hands gripped the yoke so tightly her knuckles went white. This was her life. This had always been her life. And the worst part, The part that sometimes made her want to scream into the empty Montana sky was that she had started to believe they were right. Maybe she was meant to stay small. Maybe this was all she deserved. The cabin she shared with her parents and younger brother sat at the edge of town, smaller and more weathered than most. Her father worked odd jobs when his back allowed it, which was less and less often these days. Her mother took in sewing and made cutting remarks with equal efficiency. Her brother Jacob was 16 and spent most of his time avoiding work and courting the daughter of a relatively prosperous ranch hand. Even he seemed embarrassed by Clara. She pushed through the door, water buckets scraping against the frame, and immediately felt the weight of her mother's disapproval. Margaret Whitaker stood at the stove, her thin frame rigid with the kind of permanent disappointment that had carved deep lines around her mouth. She didn't look up as Clara entered. "You're late," she said flatly. "Water should have been here an hour ago." "The creek was running high. It took longer to—" "Excuses!" Her mother's voice was sharp as a slap. Marianne never made excuses. Marianne understood responsibility. Clara set the buckets down carefully, biting back the response that climbed up her throat. Marianne didn't have to haul water anymore. Marianne had a husband who hired someone else to do the hard work. Marianne had escaped. "I'll start breakfast," Clara said quietly. "No need. Your father's already eaten and gone to see about work at the Halverson place. Jacob left early. It's just us." Her mother finally turned, her eyes cold. "We need to talk." Clara felt something drop in her stomach. Those 4 words, "we need to talk," were never followed by anything good. "Mrs. Garrett came by yesterday while you were out," her mother continued. "She mentioned that Thomas has been asking about you." For a moment, Clara couldn't breathe. Thomas Garrett, the same man who had mocked her in the street less than 20 minutes ago, the drunk who made jokes at her expense for entertainment. "No," Clara said. "No?" Her mother's eyebrows rose dangerously. "You think you have the luxury of saying no? You're 28 years old, Clara, 28. Do you understand what that means? You're aging out of every possibility you might have had. Thomas Garrett owns property. He has a business. He's not handsome, and yes, he drinks too much, but at least he's willing to consider you." "He doesn't want to consider me," Clara said, her voice shaking. "He wants someone to mock, someone to feel superior to." "I won't." "You won't what? You won't marry the only man who's shown even passing interest in you in a decade? You won't take the one chance you have to stop being a burden on this family?" The word hung in the air between them like poison. Burden. Clara's father had used it last month during an argument about money. Jacob had muttered it under his breath when she'd asked him to help carry firewood. And now her mother, the woman who was supposed to love her unconditionally, had finally said it out loud. "I work," Clara said, hating how her voice cracked. "I haul water and chop wood and cook and clean and take in washing from half the town. I contribute." "You contribute the work of a servant. That's not the same as pulling your weight. If you married, you'd be someone else's responsibility instead of ours. Do you understand? We're drowning, Clara. Your father's back is getting worse. Jacob needs money to court properly. We can't keep supporting you forever." Clara stood there, dripping creek water onto the rough wooden floor, and felt something inside her chest begin to collapse. This was her family, the people who were supposed to stand by her, and they saw her as nothing more than a financial drain. "I'll think about it," she whispered, because it was the only thing she could say that might end this conversation. Her mother's expression softened slightly, not with warmth, but with relief. "Good. Mrs. Garrett expects an answer within the week." Clara spent the rest of that day moving through her chores like a ghost. She scrubbed floors that never seemed to get clean. She mended clothes until her fingers bled tiny dots onto the fabric. She baked bread that her family would eat without comment, without thanks, without even seeming to notice she existed. And she thought about Thomas Garrett. She thought about living in a house where she would be mocked at breakfast and dinner. She thought about bearing children who would learn to be ashamed of their plain, aging mother. She thought about decades of small cruelties, casual dismissals, jokes at her expense. She thought about how that might still be better than staying here. That realization that her choices had narrowed to different versions of misery made her feel something dangerous. Not quite anger, not quite despair. Something harder and sharper, like a stone forming deep in her chest. The next morning arrived with the same brutal routine. Dawn, buckets, creek. The long walk through a town that had decided her worth years ago and never bothered to reconsider. But this morning, something different happened. Clara was halfway back from the creek, her shoulders screaming from the weight of the water, when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She moved to the side of the trail instinctively, making room for whoever was riding past. The horse slowed instead of passing. "Those look heavy." The voice was deep, quiet, and completely unfamiliar. Clara looked up, squinting against the morning sun, and saw a man on horseback she had never seen before. He was tall. She could tell even with him mounted, with broad shoulders and hands that looked capable of real work. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with dark eyes that studied her without the usual mockery or pity she had learned to expect. His clothes were simple but well made. A worn leather jacket, sturdy boots, a hat that had seen considerable use. "I can manage," Clara said automatically, because that was what you said. You didn't admit weakness. You didn't ask for help. You just carried the weight until your body gave out. The stranger dismounted in one smooth motion. "Didn't say you couldn't manage, just said they look heavy." He walked toward her with an easy confidence that made Clara take an involuntary step back. But he didn't reach for her or crowd her space. Instead, he simply lifted the yoke from her shoulders as if it weighed nothing at all. The sudden absence of pain was so startling that Clara gasped. "Where are we headed?" the man asked, already starting to walk. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to. Where are we headed?" Clara stared at him, confused by this sudden kindness from a stranger, suspicious of what it might cost her. But her shoulders were screaming in relief, and she couldn't quite bring herself to take the buckets back. "The cabin at the edge of town," she said quietly. "The small one with the crooked chimney." He nodded and started walking. Clara hurried to keep up, acutely aware of how she must look. Soaked skirt, rough hands, hair falling out of its hasty braid. She waited for him to say something cutting, something that would reveal this was all an elaborate joke, but he just walked in comfortable silence, carrying her burden like it was nothing. "You're not from Red Hollow," Clara said finally, because the silence was becoming unbearable. "No, ma'am. Name's Elias Crow. I work as foreman at Silver Ridge Ranch, about 10 miles north of here." Clara had heard of Silver Ridge. Everyone had. It was the largest ranch in the territory, owned by a reclusive man named Victor Hale, who rarely came to town. The ranch hands who worked there had a reputation for being competent and well-paid, which made them targets of envy from the struggling farmers and laborers in Red Hollow. "What brings you to town?" Clara asked. "Supplies, mostly. Ranch business." He glanced at her. "And you? You haul water every morning?" "Every morning," Clara confirmed, "sometimes twice a day in summer." "Long walk." "It's what needs doing." They reached her cabin too quickly. Clara found herself wishing the walk had been longer, that she could have stayed in this strange bubble where someone treated her like a person worth helping instead of a problem to be solved. Elias set the buckets down gently near the door. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture so old-fashioned and courteous that Clara felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. "You take care, ma'am," he said. "Clara," she heard herself say. "My name is Clara Whitaker." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close. "Clara, you take care." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Clara standing in front of her family's cabin with 2 full buckets and a feeling she couldn't quite name. Inside, her mother was waiting. "Who was that?" Margaret demanded, her face pinched with suspicion. "Just someone helping with the water," Clara said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I saw you talking to him. What did he want?" "Nothing. He was just being kind." Her mother's expression hardened. "Men aren't kind for no reason, Clara. Whatever he wants, you're not in a position to be particular. Remember what we discussed about Thomas Garrett." Clara nodded, picked up the buckets, and went to pour the water into the barrels, her mother's words echoing in her head. Men aren't kind for no reason. Maybe that was true. Maybe Elias Crow had an angle, a motive, something he wanted that Clara couldn't see yet. But for just a few minutes on that dusty trail, she had felt something she hadn't felt in years. She had felt seen. The days that followed fell back into their familiar, grinding rhythm. Clara hauled water and chopped wood and listened to her mother's increasingly pointed comments about Thomas Garrett's proposal. Mrs. Garrett had apparently told half the town about her son's interest in Clara, which had turned the whole thing into a public spectacle. People were watching to see what the old maid would do. Would she accept the drunk's offer and finally stop being a burden? Or would she refuse and confirm what everyone already suspected, that she thought herself too good for the only man desperate enough to consider her? Clara felt trapped between two humiliations, unable to choose either without confirming the town's worst opinions of her. And then, 1 week after their first meeting, Elias Crow appeared on the trail again. Clara was hauling water, always hauling water, when she heard the now familiar sound of hoofbeats slowing behind her. Her heart did something complicated in her chest. "Morning," Elias said, dismounting before she could respond. "I'll take those." This time Clara didn't protest. She let him lift the yoke from her shoulders and felt that same rush of relief, that same dangerous gratitude. They walked together in silence for a while before Elias spoke. "You do this every day?" he asked. "Haul water twice your weight across half a mile?" "Someone has to." "What about your family? Father? Brothers?" Clara felt her jaw tighten. "My father's back is injured. My brother has other priorities." "And your mother?" "My mother has opinions about how I should be spending my time. Hauling water isn't one of them." Elias glanced at her, and Clara was startled by what she saw in his expression. Not pity, not mockery. Something closer to respect. "Seems to me you're doing necessary work," he said. "Can't imagine what she'd rather you be doing that's more important than making sure the family has water." Clara almost laughed. "She'd rather I be married, preferably to anyone who'll have me." The words slipped out before she could stop them, too honest, too revealing. Clara felt her face burn with embarrassment. Why had she said that? Why had she exposed herself to the stranger who would probably laugh or, worse, offer sympathy she didn't want? But Elias just nodded slowly. "I take it there's someone specific she has in mind?" "Thomas Garrett. He owns the feed store in town. He's made an offer." "And what do you think of this Thomas Garrett?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. No one had asked her that. Not her mother, not her father, not even her sister during their brief, uncomfortable conversations. They had all told her what she should think, what she should feel, what she should do. But Elias Crow, this stranger who had no stake in her life, was asking what she actually wanted. "I think he's cruel," Clara said quietly. "I think he drinks too much and says terrible things. I think he wants someone he can feel superior to. And I think my mother is right that I should probably accept anyway because I'm 28 years old and running out of options." "That's not what I asked," Elias said. His voice was still quiet, still steady. "I asked what you think of him, not what you think you should do." Clara stopped walking. They were still half a mile from her cabin, surrounded by nothing but scrub grass and endless sky. Elias stopped too, setting down the buckets, waiting. "I hate him," Clara whispered, and the words felt like pulling a splinter from deep under her skin. "I hate that he makes jokes about me. I hate that everyone thinks I should be grateful for his attention. I hate that my whole life has narrowed down to choosing between marrying someone who despises me or staying with a family who sees me as a burden. I hate all of it." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he did something that shocked Clara completely. He smiled. Not a mocking smile. Not a pitying smile. A real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger, less weathered by whatever hard years had put those lines in his face. "Good," he said. "That's the most honest thing I've heard anyone say in months." "Good?" Claire repeated, confused. "Good. Means you haven't given up yet. Means you still know what you want, even if you can't see how to get it." He picked up the buckets again. "Come on, let's get you home before your mother starts worrying." They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, companionable. Clara found herself stealing glances at this strange man who had appeared in her life twice now, and both times made her feel a little less invisible. At her cabin door, Elias set down the buckets and tipped his hat again. "Mr. Crow," Clara said quickly, before he could leave. "Why are you helping me?" He considered the question seriously. "Because you needed help. And because you strike me as someone who doesn't ask for it nearly enough." "That's not much of a reason." It's reason enough for me." He rode away, and Clara watched him go, something shifting in her chest like ice beginning to crack. Inside, her mother was waiting with news. "Thomas Garrett's coming for dinner tomorrow night," Margaret announced, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness. "He wants to discuss the marriage properly. You'll wear your good dress, and you'll be polite, and you'll accept his proposal like a sensible woman." Clara stood in the doorway, her hand still aching from carrying water, her heart still tangled up in a stranger's unexpected kindness. "No," she said. Her mother's face went very still. "What did you say?" "I said no. I'm not marrying Thomas Garrett." "You ungrateful! Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? Do you think you'll get another chance? Do you think any other man will want you?" "I don't know," Clara said, and her voice was shaking but steady. "But I know I won't marry someone who makes me feel worthless. I've felt worthless my whole life, and I'm done." The argument that followed was spectacular. Her mother screamed. Her father, roused from his chair, added his own bitter commentary about foolish daughters who thought themselves too good for honest proposals. Even Jacob appeared long enough to call her selfish before disappearing again. But Clara held firm. And the next morning, when she walked to the creek with her buckets, Elias Crow was waiting on the trail. He didn't ask about the argument, though surely half the town had heard it. He just took the buckets from her shoulders and started walking, and Clara followed, grateful beyond words for his steady, uncomplicated presence. This became their routine. 3 mornings a week, Elias would appear on the trail and help Clara carry water. Sometimes they talked about nothing, weather, crops, the quality of the creek flow. Sometimes they talked about everything, childhoods and losses and the small, hard truths people usually kept to themselves. Elias told her about growing up poor in the mountains, working since he was old enough to hold a shovel. Clara told him about her sister's wedding, about standing in the church and realizing she would never have that, never be seen as valuable enough to celebrate. He never pitied her. She never judged him. And slowly, carefully, something began to grow between them that felt dangerous and precious and entirely new. But Red Hollow Valley was a small town with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, and it wasn't long before people noticed the quiet foreman from Silver Ridge Ranch walking with the woman everyone had dismissed. The whispers started again, but this time they sounded different, confused, threatened, jealous. And Clara, who had learned to make herself small and quiet and invisible, began to realize that perhaps her life didn't have to stay that way forever. Perhaps she had been wrong about which stories were already written. Perhaps some lives could still grow. The gossip reached Clara's mother before it reached Clara herself. Margaret Whitaker had been at the general store picking up thread when she overheard Sarah Mitchell telling her daughter about the strange sight she'd witnessed 3 mornings in a row. That foreman from Silver Ridge Ranch, the quiet one with the dark eyes, walking alongside Clara Whitaker like they were old friends, carrying her water buckets no less, as if he had nothing better to do with his time than help a woman the whole town had already written off. By the time Clara returned from the creek that afternoon, alone, as Elias had needed to return to the ranch early, her mother was waiting on the porch with her arms crossed and her face set in that expression Clara had learned to dread. "Inside," Margaret said. "Now." Clara set down the buckets and followed her mother into the cabin, her stomach already tightening with familiar anxiety. Her father sat in his chair by the cold fireplace, his face equally grim. Even Jacob had been summoned, though he looked more curious than concerned. "Sit," her mother commanded. Clara remained standing. "What's this about?" "Don't play innocent with me. Half the town is talking about you and that ranch hand walking together, talking. People are starting to ask questions." "He's not a ranch hand," Clara said quietly. "He's the foreman at Silver Ridge, and he's helping me carry water, that's all." "That's all?" Her father's voice was rough from disuse. He rarely spoke these days, which made his words carry extra weight. "Men don't help women carry water out of pure Christian charity, Clara. What does he want?" The question hit Clara like a slap. Of course they would think that. Of course they would assume Elias had ulterior motives, that his kindness was transactional, that no one would help Clara Whitaker unless they wanted something in return. "Maybe he's just a decent person," Clara said, hating how defensive she sounded. Her mother laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Decent men don't pursue women in secret. Decent men come to the door and state their intentions properly. The sneaking around, these private conversations on deserted trails, do you understand how this looks? We're not sneaking around, we're walking, in broad daylight, where anyone can see. Exactly. Margaret's voice rose. Everyone can see, and everyone is talking. Do you know what Thomas Garrett said when he heard? He said you'd made a fool of him. He said he was withdrawing his offer. Do you understand what you've done? You've thrown away your only chance at a respectable marriage for what? Some passing fancy with a man who probably has a woman in every town between here and the Canadian border? Clara felt something hot and sharp rise in her throat. Thomas Garrett was never a respectable option. He's a drunk who wanted someone to humiliate. And I don't care if he withdrew his offer. I already told you I wouldn't marry him. You don't get to be particular, her mother shouted. You don't have that luxury. You're 28 years old with nothing to offer and no prospects, and now you've ruined even that because you let some smooth-talking stranger turn your head with a few kind words. That's enough, Clara said, her voice shaking. It's not nearly enough. You're going to stop seeing this man. You're going to apologize to Thomas Garrett, and you're going to start acting like a woman who understands her place in this world. Clara looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw something that made her chest ache. Margaret Whittaker was 53 years old and looked 70. Her hands were gnarled from decades of hard work. Her face was lined with bitterness and disappointment. She had married young to a man who couldn't provide, had raised children in poverty, and had watched her dreams shrink down to nothing more than survival. And she wanted the same life for Clara. Not out of cruelty, Clara realized. Out of fear. Because Margaret Whittaker couldn't imagine anything better, and the thought of her daughter hoping for more felt like a personal indictment of every choice she'd ever made. No, Clara said softly. What did you say to me? I said no. I won't apologize to Thomas Garrett. I won't stop talking to Elias Crow. And I won't spend the rest of my life making myself smaller just to make everyone else comfortable. Her father stood up from his chair, his face darkening. You live under our roof. You follow our rules. That's how this works. Then maybe I won't live under your roof much longer. The words hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Clara couldn't believe she'd said them. She had nowhere else to go, no money saved, no plan beyond the sudden, desperate need to escape this cabin where love had been replaced by obligation and resentment. Her mother's face went very pale. Get out! Margaret, her father started. I said get out. If she wants to throw her life away on some fantasy, let her do it somewhere else. I won't watch it happen under my own roof. Clara stood frozen, shocked despite herself. She had expected anger, accusations, even threats, but she hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected her mother to actually choose this moment, this argument, as the final breaking point. Fine, Clara heard herself say. I'll go. She walked to the small corner where she slept, gathered her few belongings into a worn canvas bag, 2 dresses, a brush, her mother's old Bible that she'd been given years ago, a few small items that held memories of better times. It took less than 5 minutes to pack up 28 years of life. When she walked back through the main room, her mother had her back turned, shoulders rigid. Her father stared at the floor. Jacob watched from the doorway with wide eyes, finally understanding that something irrevocable was happening. Clara, Jacob said quietly, where will you go? She had no answer for him. She just walked out the door, down the steps, and into the late afternoon sun with her bag over one shoulder and no destination in mind. The first night she slept in the small cemetery at the edge of town, tucked against a stone marker with her coat pulled tight against the cold. The second night she found shelter in an abandoned prospector's shack about 3 miles out, its roof half caved, but still better than nothing. She had a little money saved from the washing she'd taken in over the years, enough for maybe a week of careful spending. After that, she had no idea. On the third morning, Clara was at the creek before dawn, washing her face in the frigid water and trying to figure out her next move, when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats. Elias Crow appeared through the morning mist like something out of a dream she hadn't realized she'd been having. He took one look at her. The exhaustion in her face, the bag at her feet, the way she was trying and failing to hide the fact that she'd been sleeping rough, and dismounted without a word. What happened? He asked. Clara tried to answer, but suddenly, everything that had seemed manageable in the privacy of her own mind became overwhelming in the face of his quiet concern. The words stuck in her throat, and to her absolute horror, she felt tears start to build behind her eyes. She never cried. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness that would only confirm what everyone already thought about her. But Elias Crow stepped closer and said, "It's all right. You don't have to explain right now." And something in Clara's chest just broke open. She told him everything: the argument, her mother's ultimatum, the nights in the cold, the money running out, the complete absence of any plan beyond stubborn refusal to go back. Elias listened without interrupting, his face grave. When she finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment. "I have a house," he said finally. "Small place on the edge of Silver Ridge Ranch property. It's nothing fancy, needs some repairs, truth be told, but it's weather-tight and warm. You could stay there." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She had been raised to understand that a woman didn't accept that kind of help from a man unless she was prepared to pay for it in ways that had nothing to do with money. But Elias must have seen the refusal forming on her face because he continued quickly. "Before you say no, hear me out. The house has been empty for 2 years since the last tenant moved on. It's going to waste. I'd planned to fix it up eventually, but I haven't had the time. If you stayed there, you could do some of the repairs yourself. I'd provide materials, and we'd call it even. You'd have a roof over your head. I'd have someone taking care of the property. It's a practical arrangement." "People would talk," Clara said quietly. "People are already talking. Let them." "It would damage your reputation." Something flickered across Elias's face. Not quite amusement, but close. "My reputation can handle it." Clara looked at him standing there in the early morning light, this man who had appeared in her life just weeks ago, and had somehow become the only person who seemed to see her as something other than a burden or a cautionary tale. She thought about her options, which were limited to accepting his help or trying to survive on her own with no money, no family support, and winter coming on. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. "All right," she said, "but I'll do the repairs, and I'll pay you back somehow. I don't take charity." "Wouldn't dream of offering it," Elias said, and this time he did smile. "Come on, let's get you settled before the whole town wakes up and decides to have opinions about it." The house sat about half a mile from the main ranch compound, tucked into a small valley with a view of the mountains. It was small, as Elias had said, just 3 rooms and a covered porch, but it was structurally sound. The roof leaked in one corner, several windows needed new glass, and the stove had seen better days, but Clara had lived in worse. Elias helped her carry in firewood and showed her where the well was, then stood awkwardly in the doorway like he wasn't quite sure what to do next. "I'll bring supplies tomorrow," he said. "Lumber for the repairs, some food to get you started. If you need anything before then—" "I'll be fine," Clara interrupted. "Thank you, Elias, truly." He nodded, put his hat back on, and turned to leave. Then he paused. "Clara, your mother was wrong. You're not throwing your life away." He was gone before she could respond, riding back toward the main ranch buildings and leaving Clara standing in the doorway of a house that was barely more than a shelter but felt like the first place she'd ever been truly free. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work. Clara threw herself into repairing the house with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She patched the roof, replaced broken windows with glass Elias brought from town, scrubbed years of grime off every surface until her hands were raw. She planted a small garden, repaired the fence around the property, and transformed the shabby little house into something that felt almost like a home. Elias stopped by most evenings after his work was done, ostensibly to check on the repairs, but really, Clara suspected, to make sure she was all right. They fell into an easy companionship, sitting on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his work at the ranch, about managing the cattle and the land and the complicated politics of ranching in Montana Territory. She told him about the books she'd read, borrowed from the minister's wife years ago when people still thought she might be salvageable, and the places she'd dreamed of seeing but knew she never would. "Why not?" Elias asked one evening when she mentioned wanting to see the ocean. "Because women like me don't go to the ocean. We haul water and scrub floors and hope for a decent marriage if we're lucky." "You're not hauling water anymore?" Elias pointed out. "And you turned down a marriage, decent or otherwise." "I turned down one specific marriage to one specific terrible man. That doesn't mean I'm free, Elias. I'm still living on borrowed time in a borrowed house. Eventually, people are going to demand to know what exactly is happening here, and I won't have a good answer. What if you did have an answer? Clara looked at him sharply. What do you mean? But Elias just shook his head. Never mind. Not yet. The town predictably erupted with speculation. Clara Whitaker, the old maid who had somehow snagged the attention of the Silver Ridge foreman, was now living in sin on ranch property. That was the prevailing theory anyway, whispered in the general store and discussed over Sunday dinners. The more charitable folks suggested Elias had simply taken pity on her. The less charitable had much more colorful explanations. Clara heard the rumors through Sarah Mitchell, who appeared at her door one afternoon with a basket of bread and a concerned expression. I thought you should know what they're saying, Sarah said apologetically, about you and Mr. Crow. I can imagine, Clara replied. They're calling you his mistress, saying you seduced him to get access to ranch resources. Mrs. Garrett has been particularly vocal about it. Clara felt a flash of anger, but it was overwhelmed by something else, a strange sort of freedom. Let them talk. Let them speculate. For the first time in her life, she didn't care what Red Hollow Valley thought of her. Thank you for telling me, she said to Sarah. But I'm not concerned. Sarah studied her for a moment, then smiled. You look different, Clara. Happier, maybe. Or at least less beaten down. I am, Clara said, and realized it was true. But the gossip took its toll in other ways. Clara's father showed up one evening, his face haggard, demanding she come home and stop embarrassing the family. She refused. Her sister Marianne sent a letter full of disappointment and platitudes about proper behavior. Clara burned it in the stove without finishing it. Only Jacob visited without judgment, appearing one Sunday afternoon with a guilty expression and news from home. Mother's not doing well, he said quietly. She barely eats, just sits and stares out the window. Clara felt a pang of guilt, but it was distant, muffled. She made her choice, Jacob. She threw me out. She was scared. You know how she gets when she's scared. She lashes out. I spent 28 years accommodating her fear. I won't spend the rest of my life doing the same. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, This man you're living near, Elias Crow. Is he... Are you... We're friends, Clara said firmly. That's all. But even as she said it, she wondered if it was true, because the way her heart lifted when she saw Elias riding toward her house in the evenings, the way she found herself thinking about him during the day, the way his rare smiles made her feel like the sun had broken through clouds, that didn't feel like simple friendship. It felt like something far more dangerous. The crisis came on a Wednesday morning in early autumn. Clara was in town buying supplies. She'd avoided Red Hollow for weeks, but had finally run out of things she couldn't produce herself. When Thomas Garrett cornered her outside the general store, he was drunk, even though it was barely past noon, his face flushed and his words slurring slightly. There she is, he announced loudly. Red Hollow's favorite charity case. How's life as the ranch whore, Clara? People stopped and stared. Clara felt her face burn but forced herself to keep walking. Thomas grabbed her arm. I'm talking to you. Let go of me. Why? Your foreman isn't here to defend your honor, though I suppose you don't have much honor left to defend, do you? Living out there in sin, letting him use you however he wants. Clara slapped him. The crack of her palm against his face echoed down the street. Thomas stared at her in shock, then his expression darkened into something ugly. You little... He raised his hand and Clara braced herself for the blow, but it never came. Elias Crow materialized out of nowhere, moving faster than Clara had ever seen him move, and caught Thomas's wrist in mid-swing. That's enough, Elias said quietly. Thomas tried to pull away, but Elias's grip was iron. Let go of me, Crow. This doesn't concern you. When you raise your hand to her, it concerns me. She's nothing to you, just some woman you're using until you get bored. Elias's other hand shot out and grabbed Thomas by the collar, lifting him slightly off his feet. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath it. You're going to walk away now. You're going to stay away from Clara, and you're going to keep your opinions to yourself. Because if I hear you've bothered her again, if I hear you've said one more word about her reputation, I will make you regret it. Do we understand each other? Thomas nodded jerkily, his face pale. Elias released him, and the man stumbled backward before hurrying away, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The entire street had gone silent, watching. Elias turned to Clara, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" Clara nodded, unable to speak. Her hand was still stinging from the slap, her heart racing from the confrontation, and every eye in Red Hollow was fixed on them. Elias seemed to make a decision. He took Clara's hand, in full view of everyone, and said clearly enough for the gathered crowd to hear, "Come on, let's get you home." They walked to his horse together, still holding hands, and Elias helped her mount before climbing up behind her. As they rode out of town, Clara could feel the weight of dozens of stares, could practically hear the gossip already starting to spread. But Elias's arm was steady around her waist, and for once, she didn't care what anyone thought. They didn't speak until they reached her house. Elias helped her down from the horse and followed her inside, pacing the small main room like a caged animal, while Clara tried to calm her shaking hands. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I shouldn't have intervened like that. I've probably made things worse for you." "You stopped him from hitting me," Clara said. "I'd say that's making things better, not worse." "The whole town saw me grab him, saw me take your hand. They're going to talk, Clara. They're going to assume. Let them assume." Clara sat down heavily in one of the chairs she'd repaired. "I'm tired of caring what they think. I'm tired of making myself small to fit into their narrow little boxes. I'm tired of all of it." Elias stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her, with an intensity that made Clara's breath catch. "What if you didn't have to care anymore?" he said quietly. "What if there was a way to make all of it stop mattering?" "There isn't," Clara said. "That's not how the world works." "What if you married me?" The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread out and changed everything. Clara stared at him. "What?" Elias crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. His palms were rough and warm, his expression absolutely serious. "Marry me, Clara. Not because you have to, not because you're out of options, but because I'm asking. Because these past months, knowing you have been the best months I've had in years. Because when I see you, I don't see an old maid or a burden or any of the cruel things this town has called you. I see a woman who's strong enough to survive in a world that tried to break her. I see someone I want to spend my life with." "You barely know me," Clara whispered. "I know you haul water for a family that doesn't appreciate it. I know you turned down a comfortable marriage because you refused to settle for cruelty. I know you slapped a man twice your size in the middle of town rather than let him insult you. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met and never ask for recognition. What else do I need to know?" Clara's mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. Men like Elias Crow didn't propose to women like her. This had to be some kind of pity gesture, some misguided attempt to protect her reputation. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You don't have to sacrifice yourself just because the town is gossiping. I'm not sacrificing anything. Clara, I'm asking you to marry me because I want to. Because when I think about my future, you're in it, because I'm falling in love with you." The last sentence hit Clara like a physical blow. No one had ever said they loved her. Not her parents, not her siblings, certainly not any man who had ever looked at her. "You can't," she said, but her voice was shaking. "You can't love me. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Elias's hands tightened on hers. "And I know you're scared. I know every person in your life has given you reasons not to trust this. But I'm asking anyway. Marry me, Clara. Not to stop the gossip or save your reputation or any other practical reason. Marry me because you want to. Because maybe, possibly, you feel even a fraction of what I feel when I look at you." Clara looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. No mockery, no pity. Just a man asking a question and meaning every word. And she realized, with a clarity that took her breath away, that she did feel something when she looked at him. Something that had been growing quietly over weeks of shared conversations and comfortable silences and small kindnesses. Something that terrified her because she had never expected to feel it. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I'll marry you." Elias's face broke into a smile so genuine and unguarded that Clara felt something crack open in her chest. He pulled her out of the chair and into his arms, holding her like she was something precious, and Clara let herself be held for the first time in her adult life. They were married 3 days later in a quiet ceremony at the ranch, with only a handful of witnesses, the ranch hands Elias worked with, Sarah Mitchell, who had remained Clara's friend despite the gossip, and to Clara's surprise, her brother Jacob. Her parents didn't come, neither did Marianne. But as Clara stood in her one good dress, hastily altered to fit better, and promised her life to a man she had known for less than 3 months, she found she didn't care. She was marrying someone who saw her, someone who chose her, someone who made her feel like her life could be larger than the tiny box Red Hollow had built for her. The ranch hands threw a modest celebration after the ceremony, and for the first time since childhood, Clara found herself laughing freely, dancing clumsily to someone's fiddle, accepting congratulations from people who seemed genuinely happy for her. When the evening finally wound down and she and Elias walked back to what was now their shared house, Clara felt like she was living in someone else's life, someone luckier, someone who deserved good things. Elias stopped on the porch, took her hand, and said softly, "You all right?" "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," Clara admitted, "that this is all some elaborate dream." "It's not a dream. You're stuck with me now." He squeezed her hand. "And Clara?" "I meant everything I said, every word." Clara looked up at this man who had somehow become her husband, this quiet foreman who had appeared in her life and changed everything, and felt the last of her defenses finally crumble. "I love you too," she whispered, the words strange and new in her mouth. "I didn't want to. I tried not to. But I do." Elias pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and Clara let herself believe just for a moment that maybe some stories did have happy endings after all. But she had no idea that the real story was just beginning, and that the greatest shock of her life was still waiting in the shadows of Silver Ridge Ranch. The first weeks of marriage settled into a rhythm that felt almost miraculous to Clara. She woke each morning in a house that was warm and secure, next to a man who treated her with genuine respect. Elias left before dawn to oversee the ranch operations, and Clara spent her days tending the garden she'd expanded, making repairs to their home, and slowly learning what it meant to build a life with someone who actually wanted her there. The small house felt less borrowed now. It felt like theirs. Red Hollow Valley had reacted to their marriage with predictable shock. The gossip had shifted from scandalous speculation to confused resentment. How had Clara Whitaker, the old maid, the burden, the woman everyone had written off, managed to catch a man like Elias Crow? Surely there was some trick involved, some deception. Women like Clara didn't get happy endings, but Clara was learning not to care. She had spent too many years shrinking herself to fit into their narrow expectations. Now she was Mrs. Elias Crow, and if that made people uncomfortable, that was their problem to solve. Her mother had sent one letter, delivered by Jacob. It was brief and cold, congratulating Clara on her marriage while managing to imply that she'd somehow trapped Elias through manipulation or desperation. Clara read it once, then used it to start a fire in the stove. She felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just a hollow sort of relief that she no longer had to care what Margaret Whitaker thought. The one shadow that lingered over their new life was Silver Ridge Ranch itself. Elias worked there every day, managing hundreds of head of cattle and dozens of workers, but he never talked about it in any detail. He never invited Clara to visit the main ranch house. He never mentioned the owner, Victor Hale, except in the most passing terms. At first, Clara assumed it was simply professional discretion. Ranch business was ranch business, and she had no reason to be involved. But as the weeks passed, she began to notice something strange in Elias's behavior whenever the subject came up. One evening, she asked him about it directly. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, a ritual they'd fallen into almost every night. Elias had been quieter than usual all day, his expression troubled. "Is everything all right at the ranch?" Clara asked carefully. "You seem worried." Elias was silent for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. Finally he said, "Victor Hale is sick." "The owner?" "Yes. He's been sick for a while, but it's gotten worse. The doctors don't think he has much time left." Clara felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry. Is there family who'll take over the ranch?" "No. No family." Elias's voice was strange, hollow, That's part of the problem. What do you mean? But Elias just shook his head. It's complicated. Ranch politics. Nothing you need to worry about. It was the first time he'd shut her out of something, and Clara felt it like a small wound. But she didn't push. She'd learned that some men carried burdens they didn't know how to share, and forcing the issue only made them retreat further. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening at Silver Ridge Ranch mattered more than Elias was letting on. The answer came 2 weeks later, delivered by a stranger in an expensive suit. Clara was alone at the house, kneading bread dough, when she heard a carriage approaching. She wiped flour from her hands and stepped onto the porch, surprised to see an ornate black carriage pulling up to their modest home. A man climbed out, tall, thin, with silver hair and the kind of clothes that spoke of significant wealth. "Mrs. Crow," he said, removing his hat politely. "Yes, can I help you?" "My name is Edward Thornton. I'm an attorney from Helena. I'm looking for your husband, Elias Crow." Clara's stomach tightened with instinctive worry. Attorneys rarely brought good news. "He's at the ranch. Is something wrong?" "Not wrong exactly, but there are legal matters that require his immediate attention. Matters concerning Victor Hale's estate." "I don't understand. Elias is just the foreman." "Mrs. Crow," Thornton interrupted gently, "I think perhaps your husband hasn't been entirely forthcoming about certain aspects of his situation. Is there somewhere we could wait for him? This conversation would be better had with him present." Clara invited the attorney inside, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to ask. She made coffee she barely remembered preparing and sat across from this stranger who kept glancing at her with something that looked disturbingly like pity. When Elias finally arrived home an hour later, he froze in the doorway at the sight of Edward Thornton sitting in their small front room. "Mr. Crow," Thornton said, standing, "I apologize for the intrusion, but Mr. Hale's condition has deteriorated significantly. The doctors believe he has perhaps a week, maybe less. He's asking for you." Elias's face had gone pale. Has he told anyone?" "Only me and the medical staff, but the situation is becoming urgent. Decisions need to be made about the estate, about the ranch operations, about succession. You can't avoid this conversation any longer." Clara looked between the two men, completely lost. "Will someone please tell me what's going on?" Elias closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he looked at Clara with an expression she'd never seen before. Fear mixed with resignation and something that might have been shame. "Clara," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you before we got married, but I was afraid—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair. "I haven't been completely honest with you about who I am." The word sent ice through Clara's veins. This was it, she thought, the moment when the dream shattered, when she discovered that the man she'd married was hiding something unforgivable, that her brief happiness had been built on lies. "Just tell me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Elias sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "My full name is Elias Crow Hale. Victor Hale, the man who owns Silver Ridge Ranch, is my father." Clara stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Your father?" "He and my mother were never married. She worked at the ranch house as a housekeeper. They had a relationship. I don't know if it was love or convenience or something in between, and she got pregnant. With me." Thornton cleared his throat. "Perhaps I should give you privacy for this conversation." "No," Elias said. "Stay. Clara needs to hear all of it, and you know the legal details better than I do." The attorney nodded and settled back into his chair. Elias continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam finally breaking. "When my mother told Victor she was pregnant, he gave her money and sent her away. Quietly. No scandal, no acknowledgement. She went to live with her sister in a mining town in Idaho. That's where I grew up, poor, working odd jobs from the time I was 8 years old, watching my mother work herself to death cleaning other people's houses." Clara felt her heart breaking for the child Elias had been, but she stayed silent, letting him finish. "My mother never spoke ill of Victor. She said he'd been trapped by his position, by expectations, by the need to maintain respectability. She said he was a good man in an impossible situation." Elias's laugh was bitter. "I spent my childhood hating him anyway. This man who had everything while we had nothing. This man who could have helped us but chose not to. What changed? Clara asked softly. My mother got sick, consumption. Before she died, she made me promise something. She said I should go to Montana, find Victor, and let him know what had become of her. Not for revenge, she said. Not even for acknowledgement, just so he would know. And you came. I came. But I couldn't just walk up to the great Victor Hale and announce I was his bastard son. So I took work at the ranch under my mother's maiden name, Crow. Worked my way up. Watched him from a distance, trying to figure out if he was the villain I'd imagined or the complicated man my mother had described. He recognized you, Thornton interjected quietly. About 2 years ago. You have your mother's eyes, but Victor's features. He came to me immediately, wanting to know how to handle the situation discreetly. Elias nodded. He confronted me privately, asked if I was Helen Crow's son. When I confirmed it, Elias's voice caught. He broke down, cried, said not a day had passed, that he hadn't thought about her, about the child she was carrying. Said sending her away was the biggest regret of his life. Clara's mind was reeling. The quiet foreman she'd married was actually the son of the wealthiest man in the territory. The man who had helped her carry water buckets was heir to thousands of acres and a fortune she couldn't begin to calculate. Why didn't you tell me, she asked, and hated how her voice shook. Before we got married, why didn't you say anything? Elias looked at her with such raw pain that Clara almost looked away. Because I was a coward. Because every person who's learned the truth has looked at me differently afterward. Either they see dollar signs, or they see a scandal, or they see a threat to their own interests. But you, Clara, you saw me. Just me. The man who carried your water. The foreman who liked quiet evenings and honest work. I was terrified that if I told you about Victor, about the inheritance, you'd start seeing something else. You think I married you for money? Clara's voice rose despite herself. You think I'm that calculating? No! Elias stood abruptly. That's not... I never thought that. I was afraid you wouldn't marry me at all, that you'd think I was using you to create some kind of respectable image before claiming my inheritance, or that you'd think I'd lied by omission, which I did, or 1,000 other things that would make you walk away before I had a chance to prove that what I feel for you has nothing to do with any of this. Thornton stood as well. Perhaps I should return tomorrow when you've had time to discuss this privately. No, Clara said sharply. Both men looked at her in surprise. She stood, brushing flour from her apron, trying to gather her scattered thoughts into something coherent. Mr. Thornton, what exactly is Victor Hale's plan for the ranch? The attorney glanced at Elias, who nodded wearily. Mr. Hale has named Elias as his sole heir, Thornton said. The entire estate, the ranch, the livestock, the property holdings in Helena and Butte, the investments, all of it passes to Elias upon his death. The will has been finalized and witnessed, barring any successful legal challenge, which, frankly, I don't anticipate given the evidence of paternity. Elias will become one of the wealthiest men in Montana Territory. The room seemed to tilt. Clara sat back down, her legs suddenly unsteady. There's more, Thornton continued. Victor wants to make a public acknowledgement before he dies. He wants Elias to take the Hale name legally, to move into the main ranch house, to begin assuming control of operations immediately so the transition will be smooth. He wants, in essence, to claim Elias as his son in the eyes of the world. What do you want? Clara asked Elias, ignoring the attorney entirely. Elias looked at her, and she saw exhaustion in every line of his face. I don't know. I've spent 30 years hating the idea of Victor Hale, and 2 years getting to know the actual man. He's not the monster I imagined, but he's also not innocent. He made choices that hurt my mother, hurt me. And now he wants absolution before he dies, and I don't know if I can give it to him. That's not what I asked, Clara said quietly. I asked what you want. Not what Victor wants. Not what's legally required. What does Elias Crow want? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I want to honor my mother's memory. I want to take care of the land and the people who work it. I want to build something good out of all this mess, and I want to do it with you beside me, if you'll still have me after knowing the truth. Clara looked at this man she'd married. This complicated, secretive, fundamentally decent man who had lied by omission but had never once made her feel small or worthless. She thought about the life they'd built in their tiny house, the quiet mornings and peaceful evenings. She thought about how that life was about to be shattered and remade into something she couldn't yet imagine. And she thought about what it would mean to walk away now, to claim betrayal and annul the marriage and go back to what? Her parents' cabin? A life of hauling water and accepting cruelty? She had married Elias when he was just a foreman. Now he was about to become the master of Silver Ridge Ranch. But underneath all of it, he was still the same man who had lifted buckets from her shoulders and treated her with respect when no one else would. "I'm angry," she said finally. "You should have told me. I deserved to know before I married you." "I know. But I also understand why you didn't. And I believe you when you say you were afraid." Clara stood and crossed the room to where Elias stood frozen. She took his hands in hers. "I married you, Elias. Not the ranch. Not the money. Not Victor Hale's legacy. I married you. And unless you're asking for a way out, never," Elias said fiercely. "Clara, never. Then we deal with this together. All of it. The inheritance, the ranch, the gossip that's about to explode when people find out. Together." Elias pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and Clara felt him shaking slightly. Relief, she realized. Or fear. Or some combination of both. Thornton cleared his throat delicately. "I hate to interrupt, but there are immediate matters that require attention. Victor is asking to see you, Elias. Today, if possible. And there are documents that need to be signed, arrangements to be made. The ranch operations can't simply stop while we sort out succession." Elias pulled back from Clara, but kept hold of her hand. "Will you come with me? To see Victor?" Clara's first instinct was to refuse. This was family business, complicated and painful, and she had no place in it. But Elias was looking at her with such naked need that she found herself nodding. "All right," she said, "I'll come." The main ranch house at Silver Ridge was enormous, a sprawling structure of stone and timber that dominated the landscape. Clara had seen it from a distance, but had never imagined she'd actually enter it. As they approached in Thornton's carriage, she felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale of wealth on display. A housekeeper met them at the door, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an efficient manner. She led them upstairs to a large bedroom where Victor Hale lay propped up in an ornate bed, looking like a ghost of whatever man he'd once been. He was perhaps 60, with gray hair and features that clearly mirrored Elias's own. His skin had the waxy pallor of serious illness, and his breathing was labored, but his eyes were sharp and clear when they fixed on Elias. "You came," Victor said, his voice rough. "You asked," Elias replied simply. Victor's gaze shifted to Clara. "And you brought your wife, the woman the valley can't stop talking about." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his eyes steadily. "Mr. Hale, please, call me Victor. We're family now, aren't we?" He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. The housekeeper hurried forward with water, which he waved away. "I don't have much time for pleasantries." "Elias, Edward has explained the situation?" "He has." "And? Will you accept the inheritance, take the Hale name? Let me acknowledge you properly before I die?" Elias's hand tightened on Clara's. "I'll accept the inheritance. I'll run the ranch and take care of the land and the people who work it. But I won't take the Hale name." Victor's face fell. "Elias? My mother's name was Crow. She raised me alone, worked herself to exhaustion to give me what little she could. I won't erase that to make your conscience cleaner. I'll honor your legacy by managing the ranch well, but I'll do it as Elias Crow, not Elias Hale." The room was silent except for Victor's labored breathing. Then, to Clara's surprise, the dying man smiled. "She would have been proud of you," he said quietly. "Your mother, Helen. She had that same stubborn streak, that same unwillingness to compromise her principles." He coughed again. "I loved her, in my own inadequate way, but I was young and afraid of scandal and convinced that my position in society mattered more than anything else. By the time I realized what I'd thrown away, it was too late." "She never spoke badly of you," Elias said. "She said you were a good man who made a hard choice." "She was kinder than I deserved. Victor's eyes drifted to Clara again. And you, Mrs. Crow, are you prepared for what's coming? The valley is going to lose its mind when they learn the truth. The woman they dismissed as an old maid is about to become one of the most powerful women in the territory. Clara lifted her chin. I survived 28 years of their mockery. I think I can handle their jealousy. Victor laughed, then coughed violently. When he recovered, he looked at Elias with something like approval. You chose well, son. Better than I ever did. The word son hung in the air between them, heavy with years of absence and regret. They stayed for another hour while Thornton went over legal details and Victor gave Elias information about ranch operations, property holdings, and business relationships that would need to be maintained. Clara sat quietly, trying to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. When they finally left, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. In the carriage ride back to their small house, Clara and Elias sat in silence. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the weight of everything he'd just agreed to take on. Are you all right? She asked finally. I don't know, Elias said honestly. I feel like I'm betraying my mother by accepting anything from him. But I also feel like refusing would be childish and wasteful. All this land, all these resources, I could do real good with it. I could take care of people the way no one took care of my mother. Then that's what you do, Clara said firmly. You accept the inheritance not because Victor Hale is trying to buy forgiveness, but because you can use it to build something better. Elias looked at her with such gratitude that Clara felt her heart swell. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Victor Hale died 4 days later, quietly in his sleep with Elias sitting vigil beside his bed. The funeral was scheduled for the following week, and that was when the valley would learn the truth. Thornton had already prepared announcements for the local papers. The will would be read publicly, and Clara's life, their life, would change forever. The night before the funeral, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood on their small porch, looking up at the mountains and thinking about the woman she'd been just months ago. The woman who hauled water and accepted cruelty as her due. The woman everyone had dismissed. That woman felt like a stranger now. Elias came out to join her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. Nervous about tomorrow? He asked. Terrified, Clara admitted. Everyone who laughed at me, everyone who called me worthless, they're all going to be there, watching, waiting to see how the old maid handles suddenly being important. You were always important, Elias said. They were just too blind to see it. That's sweet, but it's not true. I wasn't important. I was invisible. And tomorrow I'm going to be the opposite, and I don't know if I'm ready for that. Elias pulled her close. You don't have to be ready. You just have to be yourself. The woman who slapped Thomas Garrett in the middle of town. The woman who walked out of her parents' house rather than accept their cruelty. That woman can handle anything the valley throws at her. Clara leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence, and hoped he was right. The funeral drew nearly everyone in Red Hollow Valley and many from surrounding areas. Victor Hale had been a powerful man, and people came to pay respects, make business connections, and frankly to witness whatever drama might unfold. Clara wore a simple black dress she'd sewn herself, knowing it was inadequate for the occasion, but refusing to pretend to be something she wasn't. She walked into the church beside Elias, feeling hundreds of eyes track their movement. She saw her mother in the back, looking small and shrunken. She saw Thomas Garrett near the front, his face twisted with confusion and resentment. She saw Sarah Mitchell, who caught her eye and offered a small, encouraging smile. The service was brief and formal. Then Thornton stood to read the will. The room went absolutely silent. When he announced that Victor Hale had left his entire estate to Elias Crow, foreman of Silver Ridge Ranch, there was a collective gasp. When he explained that Elias was Victor's son, the gasps turned to shocked murmurs. And when he noted that this meant Elias's wife, Clara Crow, formerly Clara Whitaker, was now the mistress of Silver Ridge Ranch, the murmurs exploded into barely contained chaos. Clara sat perfectly still, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, and refused to show any reaction. But inside she felt something fierce and triumphant blooming. Every person who had mocked her was staring in disbelief. Every person who had dismissed her was recalculating her worth. Every person who had made her feel worthless was realizing they'd been catastrophically wrong. After the service, people approached them in waves. Some offered genuine condolences. Others offered transparent attempts at ingratiating themselves. Many just stared, unable to process the reversal of fortune they'd witnessed. Clara's mother appeared, her face pale, her hands twisting together nervously. "Clara," she said quietly, "I didn't know. I had no idea." "That Elias had money?" Clara interrupted, her voice cold. "Would it have mattered? Would you have treated me differently if you'd known marrying him would make me wealthy?" Margaret flinched. "That's not fair." "No," Clara agreed. "It's not. But it's honest. You threw me out because you thought I was making a mistake. Because you thought Elias was just another burden I was taking on. Now that you know he's not, now that you know I'm going to be powerful and wealthy, you want back in, don't you? You're my daughter. I was your daughter when you threw me out. I was your daughter when you called me a burden. I was your daughter when you cared more about what the town thought than about my happiness." Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "And I'll be your daughter when I move into that ranch house and spend the rest of my life proving that the woman you dismissed was worth 10 of you." She walked away before her mother could respond, her heart pounding but her head high. Elias was waiting near the church door, fielding questions from businessmen and ranchers who suddenly wanted to establish relationships with the new owner of Silver Ridge. When he saw Clara approaching, he excused himself immediately and came to her side. "Ready to go home?" he asked quietly. Clara looked back at the crowd, at all the people who had made her life small and painful, who were now scrambling to reposition themselves in a world where she mattered. "Yes," she said, "but not to the small house. Take me to the ranch house, our house. It's time to start our real life." Elias smiled, took her hand, and led her to the waiting carriage that would carry them to Silver Ridge Ranch, and everything that waited there. The ranch house felt like a museum when Clara first walked through its doors as its new mistress. Every room was enormous, filled with heavy furniture and dark wood paneling that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Portraits of people she didn't know lined the hallways. Expensive rugs covered floors so polished she could see her reflection. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings twice as high as any she'd ever stood beneath. Clara stood in the grand entrance hall, still wearing her funeral dress, and felt utterly out of place. "It's too much," she said quietly. Elias came to stand beside her, his own discomfort evident in the way he held himself. "Victor lived here alone for 20 years after his wife died. I don't think he changed much. It's like a shrine to a life that ended decades ago." The housekeeper who had met them at Victor's bedside appeared from a side hallway, her practical shoes clicking on the marble floor. Her name was Mrs. Brennan, Clara had learned, and she'd worked at Silver Ridge for 30 years. "Mr. and Mrs. Crow," she said with a slight curtsy that made Clara deeply uncomfortable. "The staff is assembled in the kitchen, waiting to meet you properly, and I've had your belongings brought from the foreman's house and placed in the master suite, as Mr. Thornton instructed." "We can carry our own things," Clara said quickly. Mrs. Brennan's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or approval. "Of course, ma'am, but it's already done. If you'd like to change anything about the arrangements, you need only say so." Clara looked at Elias helplessly. She had no idea how to navigate this world of servants and protocols, and rooms she'd never even imagined living in. "Perhaps we should meet the staff," Elias suggested. "Get that part over with." The kitchen was warm and bright, a stark contrast to the formal gloom of the rest of the house. 15 people stood waiting, ranch hands, stable workers, house staff, all watching Clara and Elias with varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension. Mrs. Brennan made introductions. There was Samuel, the head ranch hand who'd worked with Elias for years and looked relieved to see a familiar face in charge. There was young Mary, a kitchen maid barely 16 who kept stealing odd glances at Clara. There was Joseph, the stable master, and Catherine, the cook, and half a dozen others whose names blurred together in Clara's overwhelmed mind. When the introductions were finished, an uncomfortable silence fell. These people were waiting for Clara and Elias to say something, to establish how things would be run, to make clear what kind of employers they would be. Clara thought about the houses she'd worked in over the years, taking in washing and scrubbing floors for families who treated her like she was invisible. She thought about being dismissed and ignored and worked until her hands bled. I know this is strange for all of you, she said finally, having new people in charge. And I know my background is unusual. I won't pretend to be something I'm not. 3 months ago, I was hauling water buckets in Red Hollow Valley. I don't know the first thing about running a house like this or managing a ranch this size. She saw a few of the staff exchange glances. Mary was biting her lip, trying not to smile. But I know what it's like to work hard and be treated like it doesn't matter, Clara continued. I know what it's like to give everything you have and receive nothing but criticism in return. And I won't let that happen here. If you work hard and do your jobs well, you'll be respected and fairly compensated. If you have concerns or suggestions, I want to hear them. This ranch belongs to all of us now, and we're going to run it together. Samuel cleared his throat. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Crow, but that's not how these things usually work. Staff doesn't question the owner's decisions. Then maybe it's time things worked differently, Clara said. Elias stepped forward. Most of you know me already. I've worked alongside you for the past 2 years. That's not going to change just because my title has. Tomorrow morning, I'll be in the stables at dawn, same as always. We've got cattle to move and fences to repair and 1,000 other things that can't wait just because Victor died. He paused. But there will be some changes. Mrs. Crow and I will be reviewing wages and working conditions over the next few weeks. Anyone who wants to discuss their situation should feel free to speak with either of us. The tension in the room eased slightly. These were people who understood hard work and direct talk. Fancy speeches would have made them suspicious, but Clara and Elias's straightforward approach seemed to be exactly what they needed. After the meeting, Mrs. Brennan showed them to the master suite, a sprawling collection of rooms that included a bedroom larger than Clara's entire childhood cabin, a private sitting room, and a bathroom with actual running water and a porcelain tub. Clara stood in the middle of the bedroom, looking at the 4-poster bed with its heavy velvet curtains, and felt like she'd stepped into someone else's life. I can't sleep in this, she said. It's just a bed, Elias pointed out. It's a monument. It's ridiculous. Who needs a bed this big? Elias sat down on the edge of the mattress, testing it. Someone who spent their whole life sleeping on straw pallets and thin blankets, maybe. Someone who deserves some comfort after years of going without. Clara looked at him, at this man who had grown up as poor as she had but was trying to embrace their new circumstances instead of fighting them. Aren't you overwhelmed by all this? Terrified, Elias admitted, but also angry. My mother died in a one-room shack with a dirt floor, while Victor lived here surrounded by luxury he barely used. If I'd known about this place while she was struggling, he broke off, his jaw clenched. I can't change the past, but I can make sure the money and resources here are used for something better than collecting dust. Like what? Like taking care of the people who actually work this land. Like building schools and improving roads and making sure no one in this valley has to watch their children go hungry while rich men hoard wealth they don't need. Clara crossed the room and sat beside him on the absurd bed. The valley is going to resist that. Rich ranchers don't like it when someone threatens the established order. Let them resist. What are they going to do, mock me? Spread gossip? Elias smiled grimly. I grew up a bastard in a mining town. I've survived worse than rich men's disapproval. Clara took his hand. We're really going to do this? Stay here? Run the ranch? Try to change things? Unless you want to go back to our little house and pretend none of this happened. For a moment, Clara was actually tempted. Their small house had been peaceful, simple. Theirs. This enormous mansion felt like a trap, a test she was certain to fail. But then she thought about young Mary, the kitchen maid, who probably earned barely enough to survive. She thought about the ranch hands who worked brutal hours for wages that left them poor. She thought about all the people in Red Hollow Valley who struggled and suffered while men like Victor Hale accumulated wealth they never used. No, she said firmly, we stay. We change things, and we make everyone who dismissed us regret it. Elias pulled her close and kissed her forehead. That's my girl. The first week in the ranch house was chaos. Clara tried to establish some kind of routine, but everything felt foreign and overwhelming. Mrs. Brennan kept asking her to make decisions about menus and household schedules and whether the silver should be polished weekly or monthly. Elias was constantly being pulled into meetings with lawyers, accountants, and business associates who wanted to discuss property holdings and investments Clara barely understood. And then there were the visitors. They came in waves. Ranchers and businessmen and society women from Helena who had never given Clara Whitaker a second glance but were suddenly very interested in becoming acquainted with Mrs. Elias Crow of Silver Ridge Ranch. The most persistent was Adelaide Morrison, wife of the largest landowner in the adjacent valley. She arrived unannounced on the third day, sailing into the drawing room in an expensive dress and immediately beginning to offer unsolicited advice. "Of course, you'll want to redecorate entirely," Adelaide said, looking around the room with barely concealed disdain. Victor had no taste whatsoever. All this dark wood and heavy furniture, so oppressive. "You'll want something lighter, more modern. I know an excellent decorator in Helena who could transform this place." Clara, who had been perfectly comfortable in the room until Adelaide started criticizing it, felt defensive irritation rise in her chest. "I hadn't planned on redecorating." "Oh, but you must. A house reflects its owner, and you'll want people to see that Silver Ridge has new management, fresh blood, as it were." Adelaide's smile was sharp. "Of course, it will be quite an undertaking for someone of your background. Managing a house this size requires experience and social connections. But don't worry, I'd be happy to introduce you to the right people, help you navigate society." The implication was clear. Clara was an outsider, ill-equipped for her new role, and Adelaide was generously offering to guide her into respectability. "That's very kind," Clara said, keeping her voice even. "But I think I'll manage on my own." Adelaide's smile tightened. "Of course. I'm sure you'll do your best. Though I have to say the valley is quite curious about how all this happened. The foreman's sudden elevation, the revelation about Victor's illegitimate son, it's all very dramatic, almost like something out of a novel." "Life is often dramatic," Clara said coolly, "particularly when people have been keeping secrets." "Indeed. And secrets do have a way of coming out, don't they?" Adelaide stood, smoothing her skirts. "Well, I should let you get back to settling in, but do call on me if you need advice. I've been managing a large household for 20 years. I'd hate to see you make mistakes out of inexperience." After Adelaide left, Clara sat alone in the drawing room, shaking with anger and something close to shame. The woman had been subtly vicious, implying without quite saying that Clara was unqualified, unsophisticated, and fundamentally out of her depth. The worst part was that some of it was true. Clara didn't know how to manage a staff or navigate high society, or make small talk with wealthy women who had always existed in a completely different world. But she'd be damned if she'd let people like Adelaide Morrison make her feel small again. That evening, when Elias returned from inspecting fence lines in the northern pastures, Clara met him at the door. "We're having a dinner party," she announced. Elias blinked. "We're what?" "A dinner party, next week. We'll invite the major landowners, some businessmen from Helena, the prominent families from Red Hollow. Everyone who's been whispering and speculating and assuming we don't belong here. We'll feed them and be gracious hosts and make it clear that Silver Ridge is under new management." "Clara, you hate those people. You spent years being dismissed by them." "Exactly. Which is why I want to watch them sit at our table, eat our food, and pretend they always respected me. I want to see Adelaide Morrison's face when she realizes I'm not going to fail or apologize or disappear." Clara crossed her arms. "Unless you think I can't do it. Unless you think she's right that I'm too inexperienced. I think you could run circles around Adelaide Morrison and every other society woman in the territory," Elias interrupted. "I just want to make sure you're doing this for the right reasons." "Revenge isn't a right reason?" "Not if it's going to make you miserable." Clara considered this. Was she doing it for revenge? Partly, yes. She wanted to prove something to everyone who had underestimated her. But there was something else, too, a fierce desire to claim this space, this role, this life she'd stumbled into. To stop feeling like an imposter and start acting like she belonged. "I'm doing it because I need to," she said finally. "I need to stop hiding and second-guessing myself. I need to step into this role fully, or I'll spend the rest of my life feeling like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not." Elias studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll have a dinner party, but we do it our way, not theirs. No pretending to be something we're not. No apologizing for who we are or where we came from." "Agreed." Planning the dinner consumed the next week. Mrs. Brennan was delighted to have a project and threw herself into preparations with enthusiasm. Catherine the cook began experimenting with elaborate menus. Young Mary was assigned to polish every piece of silver in the house until it gleamed. Clara sent invitations to 30 carefully selected people, including her parents, though she suspected they wouldn't come. She agonized over every detail, determined to prove that a woman who had hauled water buckets 3 months ago could host a dinner party that would rival anything Helena society could produce. The invitations caused immediate gossip. People who had barely acknowledged Clara's existence were suddenly dying to see the inside of Silver Ridge Ranch under its new ownership. Acceptance letters flooded in, including, to Clara's genuine shock, one from her mother. Margaret Whittaker would attend, along with Clara's father and brother. The note was brief and formal, with no personal message, but the fact that they were coming at all felt significant. The night of the dinner party, Clara stood in front of the mirror in the master bedroom, hardly recognizing herself. Mrs. Brennan had insisted she needed a proper dress, and they'd commissioned one from the best dressmaker in Helena, deep blue silk with delicate embroidery, far finer than anything Clara had ever worn. Her hair was styled elegantly instead of pulled back in its usual practical braid. She looked like the mistress of a great ranch. She looked like someone important. "You're beautiful," Elias said from the doorway. He'd cleaned up as well, wearing a suit that made him look every inch the wealthy landowner he'd become. "I look like I'm playing dress-up," Clara said nervously. "You look like exactly who you are, the woman who runs Silver Ridge Ranch." He crossed the room and took her hands. "And if anyone tonight makes you feel otherwise, we throw them out. Agreed?" "Agreed." The guests began arriving at 7. Clara and Elias stood in the entrance hall, greeting each person as they arrived. Clara watched their faces carefully, the surprise, the envy, the poorly concealed resentment. These were people who had ignored or mocked her for years, and now they were in her house, on her territory, forced to treat her with respect. Adelaide Morrison arrived in a dress clearly designed to outshine Clara's, her smile saccharine. "What a charming home you have. So much potential." "Thank you," Clara said pleasantly. "We're very happy here." Thomas Garrett came, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. Several wealthy ranchers arrived with their wives, all of them clearly curious about the scandalous circumstances of Elias's inheritance. The minister from Red Hollow came, along with several prominent businessmen, and then her parents arrived. Margaret Whittaker had aged since Clara had last seen her. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. Her father walked with a pronounced limp now, his back clearly causing him significant pain. Jacob trailed behind them, looking around the grand house with wide eyes. "Mother, Father," Clara said formally. "Thank you for coming." "Clara," her mother's voice was strained. "You look well." "I am well." An awkward silence stretched between them. Clara could see her mother struggling to find words, to bridge the gap that had opened between them. But before Margaret could speak, other guests pressed forward, and the moment was lost. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, where a table that could seat 40 had been set with crystal and china that had probably cost more than Clara's family had earned in a lifetime. Clara sat at the head of the table, Elias at the foot, with their guests arranged between them. The conversation flowed around her, talk of cattle prices and railroad expansion and political developments in Helena. Clara contributed when she could, but mostly she observed. She watched Adelaide Morrison try to dominate the conversation and saw several other women grow visibly annoyed. She watched the ranchers assess Elias, trying to determine if he'd be a competitor or an ally. She watched her mother pick at her food, barely eating, her eyes constantly returning to Clara with an expression that might have been regret. Halfway through the meal, one of the ranchers, a man named Hutchinson, who owned significant property to the east, addressed Elias directly. "I'll be frank, Crow. A lot of us were concerned when we heard about Victor's will. No offense intended, but you're young and relatively inexperienced at this level of operation. Some worried you might make rash decisions that could affect the whole valley." The table went quiet. This was the confrontation everyone had been waiting for, the moment when the established powers challenged the upstart. Elias set down his fork calmly. "What kind of rash decisions concern you, Mr. Hutchinson?" Well, for instance, we've heard rumors you might be considering raising wages for ranch hands. That could create problems for the rest of us who employ workers at standard rates. Standard rates that barely keep people fed and housed, Clara interjected. Everyone turned to look at her. She felt her heart hammering but kept her voice steady. I've worked for those standard rates, Mr. Hutchinson. I know exactly what they buy, which is not enough. Hutchinson's face reddened. Mrs. Crow, with all due respect, running a ranch is different from doing day labor. There are economic realities. Yes, there are, Clara agreed. And one of those realities is that workers who are paid fairly and treated well are more productive and loyal than workers who are desperate and resentful. Another reality is that we can afford to pay better wages, so we will. If that creates problems for ranchers who have been exploiting their workers, that seems like their problem to solve, not ours. The silence that followed was electric. Adelaide Morrison looked like she'd swallowed something sour. Several of the men were staring at Clara in open shock. It simply wasn't done. Women didn't speak this bluntly at dinner parties, especially not about business matters. But Elias was smiling. My wife is right, he said. Silver Ridge will be raising wages by 20% across the board. We'll also be improving worker housing and establishing a system where anyone injured on the job will continue to receive pay while they recover. If other ranchers want to compete for good workers, they'll need to match or exceed those standards. Hutchinson sputtered. You can't just... This isn't how things are done. It's how we're doing things, Elias said firmly. Victor Hale accumulated a fortune while people struggled and died. I won't continue that legacy. Another rancher, a woman named Dorothy Chen, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. I think it's about time someone challenged the old ways. My husband and I have been trying to improve conditions for our workers for years, but we've been told we're being naive. Perhaps if Silver Ridge leads the way, others will follow. The conversation fragmented after that. Some guests were clearly angry, others thoughtful, a few openly supportive. Clara caught her mother's eye across the table and saw something unexpected there. Not approval exactly, but something close to wonder, as if Margaret was seeing her daughter clearly for the first time. After dinner, the guests moved to the drawing room for coffee and brandy. Clara found herself cornered by Adelaide Morrison near the fireplace. That was quite a performance, Adelaide said quietly. Very bold, though I'm not sure it's wise to alienate the established families so early in your tenure. I wasn't performing, Clara replied. I was stating facts, and I'm not concerned about alienating people who built their wealth on the backs of exploited workers. How admirably principled. Though principles don't help much when you're socially isolated and struggling to maintain alliances. Adelaide sipped her brandy. You're from nothing, Clara. You have no family connections, no social standing beyond what your husband's inheritance provides. Without the support of families like mine, you'll find yourself very alone in this valley. Clara looked at this woman who had everything Clara had once thought she wanted, wealth, status, social power, and felt nothing but pity. Adelaide Morrison spent her life playing political games and managing appearances, all to maintain a position that seemed hollow and joyless. I've been alone most of my life, Clara said quietly. I survived it then. I'll survive it now. The difference is that now I have resources to help people who are suffering the way I suffered, and I'm going to use them, regardless of whether society approves. She walked away before Adelaide could respond, crossing the room to where her mother stood awkwardly near the window. Can we talk? Margaret asked quietly. Privately. Clara led her to a small study off the main hallway. They stood facing each other in the lamplight, years of hurt and anger and disappointment hanging between them. I was wrong, Margaret said abruptly. About everything. About you, about your marriage, about what you deserved from life. I was wrong. And I'm sorry. Clara had imagined this moment countless times. Her mother apologizing, admitting fault, asking for forgiveness. She'd imagined feeling vindicated, triumphant. But standing here actually hearing the words, all she felt was tired. Why? She asked. Why were you so cruel to me? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Because I was terrified. Terrified of watching you end up like me, poor, trapped, married to a man who couldn't provide. I thought if I could push you into any marriage, even a bad one, at least you'd be someone else's responsibility. At least I wouldn't have to watch you suffer. She wiped at her eyes. But I was making you suffer. I was the one hurting you, not protecting you, and I didn't see it until it was too late. You threw me out, Clara said, her voice shaking. You called me a burden and threw me out with nowhere to go. I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I was angry and scared, and I lashed out, and I've been sick with guilt ever since. Margaret took a step closer. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve to ask, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Watching you tonight, seeing the woman you've become. You're stronger than I ever was. Braver, better. Clara felt tears building in her own eyes. She thought about all the years of hurt, all the moments when her mother's love had felt conditional and cruel. She thought about the girl who had hauled water buckets and believed she deserved nothing better. And she thought about the woman she was now, someone who had survived and grown and found a way to build something meaningful from the wreckage of her early life. I can't forget what happened, Clara said finally. I can't pretend those years of cruelty didn't shape me. But maybe, eventually, we can find a way forward that doesn't require pretending the past didn't happen. That's more than I deserve, Margaret whispered. Probably. But I'm not interested in giving people what they deserve anymore. I'm interested in building something better. Clara paused. There's a school I want to establish for ranch workers' children and anyone else who can't afford education. I'll need help running it. Someone who can teach reading and basic arithmetic. Would you be interested? Margaret stared at her in shock. You want me to teach? You can read and write. You're intelligent when you're not letting fear control you, and you understand what it's like to struggle. Yes, I want you to teach. If you're willing. I'm willing, Margaret said immediately. Clara, I'm willing to do whatever you need. Clara nodded, feeling something tight in her chest finally begin to loosen. This wasn't forgiveness exactly, not yet, but it was a beginning. The dinner party ended late, with guests departing in various states of approval and disapproval. As Clara and Elias stood in the doorway watching the last carriage pull away, she felt exhausted but satisfied. Well, Elias said, wrapping an arm around her waist, we've officially made enemies of half the valley's wealthy elite. Good, Clara said. Let them be angry. We have work to do. And in the days that followed, they began that work in earnest, transforming Silver Ridge Ranch from a monument to one man's wealth into something that could actually change lives throughout the valley. The transformation of Silver Ridge Ranch began with the workers' housing. Clara walked through the existing cabins 3 days after the dinner party and felt sick. These were structures barely better than the shacks she'd seen in mining camps. Single rooms with gaps in the walls, roofs that leaked, floors that flooded when it rained. Families of 5 and 6 were crammed into spaces meant for 2. Children slept on floors. Married couples had no privacy. She returned to the main house and found Elias in Victor's old study, now his office, surrounded by ledgers and property documents. The workers' cabins are unacceptable, she said without preamble. Elias looked up, unsurprised. I know. I've been living with that guilt for 2 years, watching people suffer while I worked for a man who had the resources to fix it, but never bothered. Then we fix it now, today. We start building proper houses, real homes with multiple rooms, solid construction, heating that actually works. And we do it before winter. That's ambitious. We're talking about housing for 40 families. Then we hire more builders, we buy more materials, we make it happen. Clara sat down across from him. Elias, these people are living the way I lived, the way your mother lived. We have the money to change that. What's the point of all this wealth if we don't use it for something that matters? Elias studied her for a moment, then smiled. You're starting to sound like someone who belongs in this house. I'm starting to sound like someone who's angry about injustice and has the power to do something about it. That's what I meant. They hired contractors from Helena and Butte, brought in wagon loads of lumber and supplies, and began construction on a new workers' village a mile from the main ranch buildings. Clara supervised the project personally, working alongside the builders to ensure each house met her standards. She designed simple but dignified homes, 2 bedrooms, a main living area, a proper kitchen, windows that actually closed against the weather. The ranch workers watched the construction with barely concealed disbelief. Several of them approached Clara directly, asking if this was really happening, if they would truly be allowed to live in real houses without paying exorbitant rent. "You work hard," Clara told them. "You deserve to live somewhere decent. That shouldn't be a luxury." One of the workers, a man named Thomas Kelly with 3 young children, actually cried when she showed him the house his family would occupy. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say. I've been working ranches for 15 years, and no one's ever treated us like we mattered." "You matter," Clara said firmly. "You all matter, and it's time someone made sure you knew it." While the housing construction continued, Clara turned her attention to the school she'd mentioned to her mother. She found an unused building on ranch property, a former storage barn that was structurally sound but needed significant work. Over the next month, she oversaw its transformation into a one-room schoolhouse with benches, desks, a wood stove, and shelves she filled with books ordered from Helena. Margaret Whitaker arrived the day before the school was set to open, carrying a carpet bag and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "I wasn't sure you really meant it," Margaret said, standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse, "about wanting me to teach." "I meant it," Clara replied. She was painting the walls a cheerful yellow, trying to make the space feel welcoming. "Can you start tomorrow? We have 12 students enrolled so far, ages 6 to 14. Most of them have never been to school before." Margaret set down her bag and picked up a paintbrush. "Then we'd better make sure this place is ready for them." They worked side by side for hours, not speaking much, but slowly rebuilding something that had been broken between them. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Clara wasn't sure she was capable of fully forgiving the years of cruelty, but it was a beginning, a tentative bridge across the gulf that had separated them. The school opened on a crisp October morning. Clara stood outside and watched as families arrived, ranch workers and their children, a few families from Red Hollow who couldn't afford the town school's fees, even some adults who wanted to learn to read. Her mother greeted each student by name, her manner patient and kind in a way Clara had rarely seen directed at herself. Young Mary from the ranch house kitchen was among the students, her face bright with excitement. "I always wanted to learn proper reading," she confided to Clara. "Not just enough to read recipes, but real books, stories." "Then you'll learn," Clara promised, "and maybe someday you'll teach others." The school became a focal point for the community. Clara visited often, bringing supplies and listening to her mother teach. She watched children who had seemed dull and listless come alive when given the chance to learn. She watched adults struggle with letters and numbers, their determination heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. And she watched her mother transform. Away from her husband's bitterness and the town's judgment, Margaret Whitaker became someone Clara barely recognized, patient, encouraging, genuinely invested in her students' success. It didn't erase the past, but it hinted at the person Margaret might have been if life had been kinder to her. Not everyone in the valley appreciated these changes. Adelaide Morrison led a faction of wealthy women who whispered that Clara was getting above herself, that educating workers would only make them dissatisfied with their positions. Several ranchers complained openly that Silver Ridge's higher wages and better conditions were making it difficult to retain their own workers. Hutchinson in particular became increasingly hostile. He stopped by the ranch one afternoon, his face red with anger, demanding to speak with Elias. "Your little social experiment is causing real problems," he said, standing in the ranch office with his hat clenched in his fists. "3 of my best hands just quit to come work for you. How am I supposed to run my operation when you're poaching workers with promises of unrealistic wages?" "I'm not poaching anyone," Elias said calmly. "I'm offering fair compensation for hard work. If your workers prefer that to what you're offering, perhaps you should examine your own practices. This is how it's always been done. You can't just waltz in here and upset the entire system because you have some romantic notion about helping the poor." Clara, who had been reviewing school supply orders at a desk in the corner, spoke up. "The system you're defending is built on exploitation. Of course it's upset when someone refuses to participate." Hutchinson turned to her, his expression contemptuous. "You would think that, wouldn't you? A woman who came from nothing, married up, and now thinks she understands how to run a territory. You're playing at being a philanthropist with your husband's money, but mark my words, this will fail. You'll bankrupt the ranch with your generosity, and everyone you're trying to help will end up worse off than before. Then I guess we'll find out, Clara said evenly. But I'd rather fail trying to do something good than succeed by grinding people into poverty. Hutchinson stormed out, and Elias came to stand beside Clara's desk. You know he's going to cause trouble. Him and the others like him. They'll do everything they can to undermine what we're building here. Let them try, Clara said. We're not backing down. The resistance came in various forms over the following months. Several ranchers banded together to try to manipulate cattle prices, hoping to financially pressure Silver Ridge. Adelaide Morrison organized her social circle to exclude Clara from events and gatherings, attempting to isolate her. Rumors spread through Red Hollow that the ranch was on the verge of financial collapse, that Elias was a poor manager, that Clara was bleeding the estate dry with her charitable projects. But the ranch's accounts told a different story. Despite increased wages and significant investment in infrastructure, Silver Ridge was thriving. Well-paid, well-housed workers were more productive and loyal. The school was producing a new generation of literate workers who could take on more complex responsibilities. The ranch's reputation for fair treatment attracted the best workers from across the territory, allowing them to expand operations in ways Victor had never managed. Clara kept meticulous records of everything: wages paid, houses built, school supplies purchased, ranch income and expenses. When critics accused her of financial recklessness, she could prove with numbers that treating workers well was not just moral, but economically sound. Winter came hard and early that year, with snow piling high across the Montana valleys. Clara watched from the windows of the main house as workers returned each evening to homes that were warm and secure, their children fed and safe, and felt a fierce satisfaction. A year ago, those same families would have been struggling in drafty shacks, burning furniture for heat, wondering if they'd survive until spring. On Christmas Eve, Clara and Elias organized a celebration at the ranch. They invited all the workers and their families, along with students from the school and anyone else in the area who wanted to come. The ranch's great dining hall was filled with food, music, and laughter. Children ran between tables while adults shared stories and songs. Clara's mother played piano, badly, but with enthusiasm, while Sarah Mitchell led a group in carols. Even Jacob had come, bringing news that their father's health was declining. He asked about you, Jacob told Clara quietly. Asked if you were happy. What did you tell him? The truth, that you're happier than I've ever seen you, that you're doing more good in a year than most people do in a lifetime. Jacob paused. He said he was proud of you. I know that's probably too little too late, but I thought you should know. Clara felt a complicated tangle of emotions: anger at the years of neglect, sadness for time wasted, and a small, reluctant warmth at the idea that her father might finally see her worth. Thank you for telling me. As the evening wound down and families began departing, Thomas Kelly approached Clara with his 3 children in tow. Mrs. Crow, he said, his voice thick with emotion. My eldest, James here, he can read now, really read. He read me a whole story last night that your mother gave him from the school. I never learned my letters, and I always thought that was just how things were. But watching my boy read, he broke off, wiping at his eyes. You gave him a future. You gave all of us a future. I just wanted you to know what that means. Clara knelt down to James's level. The boy was perhaps 9, thin but healthy, his eyes bright with intelligence. What story did you read? She asked. It was about a boy who went on an adventure, James said shyly. He was brave and helped people. Maybe someday you'll go on adventures too, Clara said. Maybe you'll help people. There's no limit to what you can do now that you can read. After they left, Clara found herself standing alone in the nearly empty dining hall, surrounded by the remnants of the celebration. Elias came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. Tired? He asked. Exhausted, but in a good way. Clara leaned into him. A year ago, I was hauling water buckets and believing my life would never be more than that. Now I'm here doing this, and it feels almost impossible. It's not impossible. It's real. You made it real. Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. The cruelty and dismissal, the moment Elias had lifted those buckets from her shoulders, the terrifying leap of faith that marriage had required, the shocking revelation of his inheritance. Every step had felt impossible at the time, but somehow she'd survived each one and emerged stronger. "We made it real," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "You could have," Elias said. "Maybe not in exactly this way, but you would have found a way to help people. It's who you are." As winter deepened into January and February, Clara's father's health continued to decline. She visited him once, finding him in bed in the same cabin where she'd grown up. He looked ancient, shrunken, barely recognizable as the man who had once seemed so formidable. "Clara," he whispered when she sat beside his bed. "My girl." "I'm here, Father. I was wrong about you, about everything. You were never the burden I made you feel like. You were the strongest of all of us, and I was too blind to see it." He reached for her hand with fingers that trembled. "Can you forgive an old fool?" Clara looked at this dying man who had contributed to so much of her pain. She thought about holding grudges, about the satisfaction of refusing forgiveness, about justice and fairness and all the complicated mathematics of human relationships. "I forgive you," she said quietly, and found to her surprise that she meant it. He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was small and simple. Clara stood between her mother and brother and felt oddly detached, as if she were watching someone else's grief from a distance. She had mourned the father she'd wanted years ago. This death was just the final acknowledgement of something long finished. Spring arrived with its usual Montana violence, sudden warmth, flooding creeks, wildflowers erupting across hillsides. Clara walked through the workers' village and saw children playing in yards around sturdy houses. She visited the school and watched students of all ages bent over books, their faces concentrated and eager. She reviewed the ranch accounts and saw evidence of prosperity built on fairness rather than exploitation. And she realized something profound. She had built exactly the kind of world she'd dreamed of during those long mornings hauling water, a world where hard work was respected and rewarded, where people had opportunities regardless of their backgrounds, where kindness was valued more than social standing. One afternoon in late April, Adelaide Morrison appeared at the ranch house unannounced. Clara considered refusing to see her, but curiosity won out. Adelaide looked different, less polished, more uncertain. She stood in the drawing room twisting her gloves in her hands. "I owe you an apology," she said abruptly. "I've been cruel and dismissive and petty, and you didn't deserve it." Clara waited, saying nothing. "The truth is I was threatened by you," Adelaide continued. "You did what I never had the courage to do. You rejected the rules that make society comfortable. You looked at how things were and decided to change them. And instead of admiring that, I tried to tear you down because it made me feel better about my own cowardice." "What changed?" Clara asked. "My daughter." Adelaide's voice cracked slightly. "She's 15. Last month she asked me what I'd accomplished with my life, what I'd done that mattered beyond hosting parties and managing servants, and I realized I had no answer. I've spent my entire life maintaining appearances and accumulating social capital, and I have nothing to show for it that will outlive me." Clara felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. She had been so focused on the cruelty of women like Adelaide that she hadn't considered the possibility that they might be trapped in their own ways, unable to see beyond the narrow world that defined their worth. "It's not too late," Clara said. "The school always needs help. So does the workers' cooperative we're starting. If you genuinely want to do something meaningful, there are opportunities." Adelaide looked up, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. "You would let me help? After everything I've done?" "I'm not interested in holding grudges," Clara said. "I'm interested in building something good. If you want to be part of that, you're welcome." Adelaide started slowly, an hour a week at the school, helping younger students with reading. But she returned consistently, and Clara watched her transform much as Margaret had. Away from the pressure to maintain social standing, Adelaide revealed a sharp intelligence and genuine warmth that had been buried under years of performance. By summer, the school had expanded to 2 rooms with 3 teachers. The workers' village was complete, with families settled into homes they could barely believe were theirs. The ranch was more profitable than it had been under Victor's management, proving definitively that ethical treatment of workers and financial success were not mutually exclusive. Clara stood on the porch of the main house one evening in late June, watching the sun set over the mountains, and felt Elias's arms wrap around her from behind. "Happy?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said, and meant it completely. "I didn't know I could be this happy." "You deserve it. You've earned every bit of it." Clara thought about the woman she'd been a year and a half ago. Dismissed, mocked, convinced her life would stay small forever. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. "I was thinking," Elias said carefully, "about expanding our reach beyond the ranch. There are other valleys, other communities where workers are being exploited. What if we used our position to advocate for labor reforms across the territory, real changes in law and policy?" Clara turned in his arms to face him. "That would make us even more enemies. The ranchers who already hate us would fight back hard." "I know. But we've proven it can work here. Imagine if we could prove it everywhere." Elias paused. "We could change the entire territory, Clara. Not overnight, but slowly. One community at a time." Clara looked at this man who had seen her worth when no one else would, who had married her not despite her background, but because of the strength it had forged in her. She thought about the power they'd accumulated. Not just wealth, but influence, connections, proof that a better way was possible. "Let's do it," she said. "Let's change everything we can." Over the following months, they began reaching out to workers' groups in other areas, sharing what they'd learned at Silver Ridge. Clara wrote articles for newspapers in Helena and Butte, documenting the ranch's success and arguing for labor reforms. Elias met with territorial legislators, pushing for laws that would protect workers' rights and establish minimum standards for wages and working conditions. The resistance was fierce. Powerful ranchers and businessmen fought back, using every tool at their disposal: legal challenges, smear campaigns, economic pressure. But Clara and Elias had something their opponents didn't. They had proof that treating workers well was not just moral, but practical, and they had the moral authority of people who had lived through poverty themselves. Gradually, slowly, things began to change. Other ranches started improving conditions, if only to compete for workers. Territorial laws were passed establishing minimum wages and basic safety standards. The school model Clara had pioneered was copied in other communities. It wasn't a revolution. It was too slow and incomplete for that. But it was progress, real and measurable, built on the foundation that Clara and Elias had laid at Silver Ridge Ranch. 2 years after Victor's death, Clara stood in the completed workers' village and watched children play in a community center they'd just built. Beside her, Margaret taught a reading class to a group of adults who had never had the chance to learn. Adelaide Morrison was organizing a fundraiser for expansion of the school system. Sarah Mitchell had become the village's informal mayor, coordinating between families and ranch management. Thomas Kelly's son, James, now 11, came running up to Clara with a book clutched in his hands. "Mrs. Crow, I finished it, the whole thing." He held up a copy of a novel Clara had ordered from New York, and I understood all of it. "That's wonderful, James. What will you read next?" "Everything," he said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "I'm going to read everything." Clara watched him run off and felt tears prick at her eyes. This boy would have opportunities his father never had. He would make choices based on preference rather than desperation. His life would be larger than the narrow box poverty had tried to trap him in. That evening, Clara and Elias walked through the ranch together, something they did most nights now. They passed the workers' village, the school, the new cooperative store they'd established, the medical clinic they'd built after hiring a young doctor from Helena who believed in affordable health care. "Do you ever think about Red Hollow?" Elias asked. "About how things were before?" "Sometimes," Clara admitted, "but it feels like a different life, like it happened to someone else." "Do you miss anything about it?" Clara considered the question seriously. Did she miss hauling water until her back screamed? Miss being dismissed and mocked? Miss the constant fear that she would die alone and forgotten? "No," she said finally. "I don't miss any of it, but I'm grateful for it." Elias looked at her in surprise. "Grateful? It made me who I am. It taught me what matters and what doesn't. It gave me the ability to see suffering in others because I'd experienced it myself." Clara paused. If I'd been born wealthy and comfortable, I might have ended up like Adelaide was, blind to injustice because it didn't affect me. The cruelty I experienced made me capable of fighting against cruelty. So yes, I'm grateful. Not for the pain itself, but for what it taught me. They reached the main house as full darkness fell. Inside, Mrs. Brennan had prepared dinner. Young Mary was studying at the kitchen table, preparing to take a teaching position at one of the new schools opening in a neighboring valley. Samuel was meeting with Elias later to discuss promoting several workers to management positions. Clara stood in the entrance hall of the house that had once felt like a museum and now felt like home. She thought about all the lives that had been changed, not just hers, but hundreds of others. She thought about the children who would grow up with opportunities their parents never had. She thought about the slow, difficult work of building a better world. The woman everyone had mocked had become the most powerful voice in the valley. But more importantly, she had become someone who used that power to lift others rather than elevate herself. On a warm evening in early autumn, Clara sat on the porch with Elias watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Her mother was teaching an evening class in the village. Adelaide was organizing a healthcare initiative for workers in the surrounding valleys. Sarah's children were playing in the yard of a house they actually owned, thanks to a land ownership program Clara had established. "We did it," Elias said quietly. "We actually changed things." "We're still changing things," Clara corrected. "This is just the beginning." She thought about the girl she'd been, carrying water buckets and believing she deserved nothing better. She thought about the moment a stranger had lifted that burden from her shoulders and set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. She thought about how some stories that seemed finished were actually just beginning, how lives that seemed destined to stay small could grow beyond anything imaginable. And she thought about the truth she had learned through years of struggle and transformation, that the woman everyone dismissed was never worthless. She had simply been waiting for the chance to prove what she was capable of when given the opportunity and the resources to build something meaningful. Clara Whitaker, now Clara Crow, mistress of Silver Ridge Ranch, advocate for workers' rights, builder of schools and communities and a better world, leaned against her husband and watched the Montana sky burn with color. She had risen not through fortune alone, though fortune had played its part. She had risen because she remembered exactly what it felt like to be powerless, and she had chosen to build a world where fewer people would ever feel that way again. The valley that once laughed at her now spoke her name with respect, but more importantly, the people she'd helped spoke her name with gratitude, and that made every hardship, every struggle, every moment of doubt worth enduring. Because Clara had learned the most important truth of all, that change was possible, that systems could be challenged, that one person with resources and determination and the memory of suffering could actually make a difference. And she had the rest of her life to keep proving it.